Welcome to the deep dive.
Okay, so today we're looking way up, at those persistent lines jets sometimes leave across the sky. You see them, everyone sees them. And while they're pretty visually striking, but also really politically charged. You've probably heard the term chemtrails thrown around online. But the sources we're examining today, they really dislike that term. They actually call it propaganda designed for, quote, instant marginalization.
Exactly. And just to be clear, our goal here isn't to, prove or disprove anything ourselves. We're analysts. We're taking a deep dive into these specific source materials that argue these aren't just contrails. They claim these are evidence of large-scale covert operations. Climate engineering, or geoengineering is what they call it. So we'll unpack what the sources say is the purpose, the methods they allege are used, and the impacts they document, strictly sticking to the material provided. Okay, so let's get the terminology straight first, because that seems key here. The standard explanation, the one you'll find on, say, Wikipedia, is that chemtrails is an erroneous belief. The belief that normal condensation trails, or contrails, are secretly laced with chemicals for, nefarious purposes, things like controlling the weather or population control or managing solar radiation.
Right, that's the official line. But the sources we're looking at argue that whole chemtrails framing is a trap. It's designed, they say, to immediately shut down any serious scientific discussion. They insist we should use the established scientific terms. Solar radiation management, or SRM, stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, or cloud albedo enhancement. That last one just means making clouds brighter, more reflective. Their point is, if you stick to the actual scientific language, the concepts used in climate engineering patents and literature, then, quote, they can't marginalize us.
All right, so let's get into their core argument against the simple condensation trail, or contrail explanation. Why do the sources say that doesn't hold water, so to speak?
It really comes down to persistence, how long these trails last. See, normal contrails are basically ice crystals formed from water vapor. They should dissipate pretty quickly. Seconds, maybe minutes, depending on atmospheric conditions. But the trails documented in these sources, they linger. Sometimes 20 minutes, 40 minutes, even an hour or more. They spread out, form artificial-looking cloud cover. The argument is that simple frozen water vapor just can't do that. It requires something else, like larger particulate matter, to hang around that long.
And they're not just saying it's leftover particles in normal exhaust, right? They're claiming active dispersal.
Yes, exactly. They point to a lot of film footage, apparently showing military aircraft. They name specific types like KC-10s, KC-135s, even C-17 Globemasters. And this footage supposedly shows visible nozzles turning these dispersion plumes on and off mid-flight. It's not like a constant engine exhaust stream.
Okay, nozzles imply intent. What about actual physical sampling?
Right.
Did they test what's in these persistent trails?
They cite specific instances of testing. Apparently, a NOAA flying laboratory was used to collect samples directly from these plumes. And those samples were then processed at reputable places. Rensselaer Polytechnic, RPI is mentioned.
Right, so the million-dollar question.
Mm-hmm.
What did these analyses allegedly find in the samples?
Okay. According to the source material, and they stress this is documented, not theory, the key finding was bioavailable, free-form aluminum nanoparticles. Emphasis on free-form and nanoparticles, meaning not bound up chemically and incredibly tiny. Small enough, they say, to be readily absorbed by living things and cause damage. Highly toxic is the term used. They also list other things: barium, strontium, manganese, and then some maybe more surprising things: surfactants, polymer fibers, and even graphene.
Polymer fibers and graphene. Wow, okay. So if this is all being sprayed, according to the sources, what's the supposed grand purpose behind it all?
The main stated goal, the one that connects to those scientific terms like SRM, is solar radiation management. The basic idea, which isn't actually secret in climate science circles, is to deliberately reflect a small fraction of incoming sunlight back into space. Why? To counteract global warming, to slow the planet's heating. The sources essentially argue this is the desperate, perhaps covert response to the immense pressure to do something about climate change.
Let's talk scale then. If this is happening, it can't be minor. What do the sources say about the scope? How widespread is this alleged operation?
Oh, it's described as absolutely massive, global.
Yep.
The estimate provided is somewhere between 40 and 60 million tons of nanoparticles dispersed every single year.
A million tons annually.
Annually, globally, and they point fingers. The U.S. military is identified as the biggest player by far. Apparently, the U.S. possesses something like 3 times more aerial tankers, the kind of planes they say are used for these high-altitude dispersions, than all other world militaries combined.
Okay, 40 to 60 million tons of nanoparticles, including aluminum. The sources claim this isn't helping, but is actually, quote, making a bad situation worse. What kind of damage are they talking about?
They detail a whole cascade of ecological and health impacts. It starts with direct contamination. They cite rain tests showing alarming levels of aluminum. One example given is a single rain event measuring 3,450 parts per billion of toxic, bioavailable aluminum.
That sounds incredibly high.
It is. And this aluminum, they claim, gets into the soil. It poisons the microbiome, the tiny organisms essential for soil health. It also damages tree root systems, basically blocking their ability to absorb nutrients.
Ah, so that connects to their claims about forests dying off.
Yeah.
They say it's not just beetles or drought, but that the trees are weakened, starved from the roots up, making them vulnerable.
Precisely. The beetles are just finishing the job, according to this view. And it extends beyond trees. The wildlife collapse figures cited are, frankly, terrifying. An 80 to 90% decline in global insect populations, both on land and in water. Atlantic plankton populations down 90%. And plankton produce a huge amount of our oxygen.
90%. That's almost unbelievable.
It's a stark claim. They also state global wildlife populations overall are down about 75% in just the last 4 years. And they mention specific findings like dead whales washing ashore with, quote, extraordinary amounts of aluminum detected in their tissues.
What about the atmosphere itself? Spraying particles way up high must have consequences there, too.
Absolutely. The sources argue that these climate engineering activities are the single greatest damaging factor to the Earth's ozone layer. They claim it's leading to a near-functional collapse of ozone protection, which means more harmful UV radiation getting through, and potentially makes the planet more vulnerable to things like solar flares, coronal mass ejections.
Beyond these huge environmental threats, there's also a mention of a more immediate, practical impact, especially concerning solar power.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle. One of the main researchers highlighted apparently got started down this path because his own off-grid solar panels were drastically underperforming. The claim is that on days with heavy spraying, off-grid users can lose 50, even 70% of their expected solar energy uptake. And even large commercial solar farms are reportedly producing sometimes only half of what they were designed to generate because of this persistent, particle-laden haze blocking sunlight.
The idea of deliberately controlling weather, managing the sun, it sounds like science fiction. But the sources argue this isn't new thinking, especially for governments and militaries.
Not at all new, according to this material. They point to historical documents. There's apparently a 1978 U.S. Senate document that discusses the scope of weather modification programs. It even calls for cooperation between governments on it. And they often bring up that quote attributed to President Lyndon Johnson back in 1962. He who controls the weather controls the world.
That quote definitely sets a certain tone. It leads right into the claims that climate engineering isn't just about cooling the planet, but is being used as a weapon, a form of warfare.
Yes, that's a major assertion in the sources. They give examples, like alleging that certain countries, particularly those targeted after 9/11, suddenly experienced unprecedented droughts like once-in-1,000-year events. And they ground this possibility in documented history. Operation Popeye during the Vietnam War.
Operation Popeye. That was the U.S. military cloud seeding program, right, to increase rainfall over enemy territory.
Exactly. It was successful enough, apparently, that it directly led to the 1976 Environmental Modification Convention, the ENOD Treaty. But here's the crucial loophole the sources emphasize. The treaty bans hostile use of weather modification during wartime. It doesn't forbid a country from doing it over its own territory or potentially for other strategic, non-wartime purposes.
Okay, so historical precedent, a potential treaty loophole. What about the technology today? How do they claim storms are being manipulated now?
The sources focus a lot on facilities like ARP in Alaska. That's the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It's described as an ionosphere heater. It transmits enormous power. 3.6 million watts is the figure cited up into the ionosphere, the electrically charged upper layer of the atmosphere. The claim is that by heating and manipulating the ionosphere, they can influence the jet stream, control high and low pressure zones, and essentially steer or intensify major storm systems.
Steer hurricanes, like Harvey or Helen, which are mentioned, and even create snowstorms.
That's the claim. They mention specific hurricanes. And engineered snow is another example given. They point out that the Chinese government, for instance, has openly stated they've created snow using specific endothermic elements, things that cause cooling to turn rain into snow for specific events or regions. The implication drawn by the source material is that what we see as natural weather events are often anything but, that meteorologists are sometimes just reading forecasts influenced or dictated by defense contractors heavily involved in these technologies, like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin.
If this is all happening on such a massive global scale, involving military aircraft and a complex technology, how could it possibly be kept secret? That seems like the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, the sources address that directly. They allege a multi-pronged approach to maintain secrecy. One key claim is an illegal federal gag order on personnel within the National Weather Service, NWS, and NOAA. They quote alleged insiders saying, essentially, "We all know it's happening, but we can't talk. We have no First Amendment rights on this issue."
A gag order. What about pilots? Commercial pilots fly those same altitudes.
The sources suggest commercial pilots might be unwitting participants. The idea proposed is that automated systems, possibly implemented around the year 2000, could be deploying materials from commercial aircraft without the pilot's direct knowledge or control. Small payloads, integrated systems.
Okay, gag orders, automated systems. They also argue that the way we measure air quality is designed to miss this stuff.
That's critical to their argument about plausible deniability. Standard air quality monitoring looks for particulate matter-sized PM10 and PM2.5. PM2.5 is tiny, small enough to get deep into your lungs. But the sources say compared to the nanoparticles used in geoengineering, PM2.5 particles are like boulders. These nanoparticles are allegedly up to 100,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair. Way too small for standard filters and sensors to detect or measure accurately.
So the test wouldn't even pick them up. And there's another element to the deniability argument involving coal fly ash.
Yes, they cite a peer-reviewed study that apparently implicates coal fly ash, the waste product from burning coal, as a potential primary material for these aerosols. Why? Well, allegedly because it contains many of the necessary elements, like aluminum and barium. It provides a way to dispose of toxic industrial waste. And crucially, its presence offers plausible deniability, as these elements can then be attributed to industrial pollution rather than deliberate spraying.
This level of alleged deception, potentially harming the environment and public health, it sounds extreme. How did the sources justify suggesting the government is capable of this?
They point to past government actions. Specifically, they cite historical records, apparently confirmed up to 1977, showing the U.S. military conducted at least 239 open-air biological warfare tests. These tests were conducted over populated areas on, quote, innocent, unknowing civilians. The argument is, if they did that then, why wouldn't they conduct these alleged geoengineering programs now if deemed necessary for national security?
And that brings us back to some of those stranger materials found in the rain samples, the polymer fibers and graphene.
Right. The sources connect those directly to that history of biological testing. They claim these materials are known military biological carrier platforms, designed specifically to carry pathogens like viruses or bacteria, attach to them in clouds, and deliver them efficiently to the ground, potentially infecting populations.
That's a very serious claim. It does seem like this topic, whatever the truth, is gaining some official traction, though. You mentioned legislation.
Yes, it's definitely moving beyond just online forums. The sources note that, as of their reporting, 36 U.S. states have legislation pending that aims to investigate or outright ban geoengineering activities. And 2 states, Tennessee and Florida, have apparently already passed laws prohibiting these practices within their borders. So state governments are starting to formally address these concerns.
Okay, so bringing this all together, after diving into the source material, what's the main takeaway they want people to understand?
If you synthesize all their claims, data, and arguments, the core assertion from these sources is stark. They believe climate engineering, as allegedly practiced, is the single most destructive human activity on the entire planet, period. They argue that by poisoning soil, water, and air with things like bioavailable aluminum, by causing collapses in vital populations like insects and plankton, and by degrading the ozone layer, these programs are actively dismantling Earth's natural life support systems, the very systems that might otherwise help mitigate climate change. For listeners who want to dig into the specific data, the footage, the patents they cite, the main platform mentioned is geoengineeringwatch.org.
It's a lot to consider, and it leaves us with a pretty heavy final thought, based on everything presented in these sources. If programs on this alleged scale, with these kinds of claimed historical roots and consequences, could exist, and if they necessitate, as claimed, illegal gag orders and the systematic obfuscation of science. It makes you wonder what else might be deemed a national security threat that authorities could decide to unilaterally mitigate completely outside public knowledge or consent. It certainly reframes the role of protectors versus actors, something to think about.